Well, good morning, everyone. It's a nice early start, so we all hope everyone's caffeinated and even hydrated. Thank you all for joining us. Big topic in 30 minutes.
Yes.
Mark, when you look at environmentalists, I mean, they've widely hailed the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act as a game-changing, piece of legislation that considerably improves global efforts. Is the race to the top actually working?
Well, I think the first thing to say is it is a very impactful piece of legislation. It's simple, it's straightforward to understand. Pardon me. It is predictable. It's going to be in place for 10 years. We can debate the politics of that, but I think facts on the ground will mean that it's in place for 10 years. And it's transformative. It's moving the decarbonization curve down across a wide range of technologies by an average of 40, 50%. Some cases 70 to 90%. And it's driving a huge amount of investment, $500 billion in projects already, potentially $3 trillion in total over that 10 period. So it's a game changer, absolutely, and it's forcing a reaction by other countries. With the exception of China, no other country has the resources and the capabilities of the United States, so decisions have to be made within that. And of course it links in, and maybe I should stop here, with the broader set of themes we've been discussing over the course of the last 2 days, which is the rewiring, the reorientation of the global economy. And one of the big questions is, which countries can take advantage of being part of value chains that are connected to the IRA, and who just benefits from technology cost curves being driven down over time that ultimately spills over around the world?
So, Shemara, where do you see the IRA having made the most material difference?
Well, I mean, I unusually agree with Mark on everything he said this time, but I think, my view is for this climate transition to happen, the big thing we need is solutions at an affordable price so that people in energy, transportation can transition and get off the conventional ways, which they can't do till we have solutions. And the biggest challenge is bringing those solutions down to affordable cost. And innovation is required there. So, UK and the European countries played that role in wind, and wind and solar have now become really affordable energy alternatives, albeit intermittent and needing firming. It's happened in EVs. The Japanese played quite a role in that. The US is playing a big role, I think, at the moment. Out of the money being invested, a lot of it is going to electric vehicles. So they're giving a $7,500 credit per vehicle, and the estimate is that passenger vehicles are going to go up by 13 times by 2030. This is IEA versus 3 times without the IRA. That's helping. A big one is on hydrogen. We really need a form of firming for renewable energy, and the estimate is there'll be 5.5 million tonnes of green hydrogen by 2030, but we need to get that price down to, say, $2 a kilogram, and the incentives in the US will probably crack the code for the world. And as Mark says, those technologies can get rolled out. Carbon capture, they're doing a lot in. We're doing various projects in the US, like we have something called Inspiration Mobility, looking to bring electrification of larger vehicles, corporate fleets, etc. And there's incentives helping on that. Even on wind and solar for the US, the apprenticeship investments will bring the cost down. So I think across the spectrum, but principally in those new technologies, so hydrogen, sustainable aviation fuels for long-haul transport, agriculture, we are doing a program for nitrogen fertilizer being made out of hydrogen rather than fossil fuels using IRA incentives. And people may not know that there's, out of fertilizer, more emissions than out of air transport and shipping combined. So I think it's these new technologies, be it in hydrogen for firming in energy, transportation, in long-haul transport, carbon capture mechanisms. The US will help crack the code, I think, for the world in a lot of those.
Overall, because of the global uncertainty, geopolitics, but also economically, is capital still going to where it should be for the green transition?
Sorry, say again.
When you look at capital, is money still going where it needs to be to make this a sustainable and long-term transition?
Yes, definitely. I think this is stimulate a new wave of global green investment. Particularly, it's kind of introduced the raising among the countries to the most needed segment. You can see what's happening in Singapore here. The Singapore government is now introducing first ever contract for difference for the green hydrogen. So USC, France is launching green tax credit incentive system as well to develop the battery segment. And overall, Japan is wanting to build domestic competitiveness for EV and overall. So it's kind of a global movement, and it's really good for global green investment. For particularly, let's say one case is now with IRA incentive, if you bring in the form of ammonia, so which is a green hydrogen, cracking back from US to Europe, now you are able to reach around $1.5 to $2.5 per kilogram. But previously estimation in the Europe, this cost is going to be around $3 by 2030. That's a clear evidence. And this IRA is really put money to stimulate investment in this most wanted segment.
Yeah. Mark?
Well, just pick up on a few of those comments and maybe draw a bit of a contrast between what's happening in the U.S. and what happens elsewhere, with the overall point that, and the IMF did some work last month, which said that, look, if the world only drives the transition through subsidies, through tax credits and support, it's going to add about an additional 50 percentage points of debt to GDP to already indebted companies. So, and I alluded to this at the start, as a country, not the United States, let's say the rest of us, you need to use a combination of supports, of regulations, contracts for differences, and others to provide the signals and candidly piggyback off of what's being driven down in terms of the cost. Because as Shemara rightly says, let's take carbon capture and storage. So Brookfield's got about $1.4 billion of investment in the U.S. Today in carbon capture and storage. That's going to help drive down, I mean, that's, you know, in and of itself, it benefits from the IRA, but it will help drive down those costs. The hydrogen investments that are being made in Europe and elsewhere will help get those costs down. But when you look at what Singapore is doing with Lei, is using a contract for difference, so providing a floor price, some certainty farther out, less of a subsidy, and working with a partner who's already, you know, independently well ahead on the cost curve. And so countries are going to have to decide where in the value chain they want to be and which instruments they use to maximum effect, because you can't be competitive in everything, and you certainly can't subsidize everything.
But has there been a step back, Shemara, because of, I guess, uncertainty or because of all the crises? Has there been a global step back where we go 2 steps forwards, 1 step backwards?
Look, I think what we've had is, with inflation rising, supply chain constraints, costs have gone up a lot, labour costs, materials, shipping. So it means that some of the benefits we've got of bringing costs down are being reversed. But if I could use the UK as an example, and talking of contract for difference, when, I think the role of governments is to catalyse private investment. So take it through that phase where there isn't the return for risk for the private market, and then they'll take and run with it. So in the UK, the cost of offshore wind when they did the first contract for difference was £140 a megawatt hour. We bid projects at 120. They had come into £37.5 because the UK basically spurred an industry of offshore wind that was very competitive. The last round at £44 had no bids, and that's reflecting the costs having gone up. So there's, that's 20% higher. They still couldn't get bids. Ørsted have said they've had 40% cost increases. But I think the wholesale price of energy in the UK is about £80 a megawatt hour at the moment. So they can afford to go to £50 for offshore wind and still bring on offshore wind. But I think they've cracked the code on bringing the cost down to be competitive with alternatives. And yes, we're having a little bit of a retracing in places where we have cracked the code, but not to a point where it's not viable. Right. But I do think, as Mark says, in things like carbon capture, hydrogen, we need big countries like the US to help, sorry to use this expression, but crack the code and make it affordable. Yeah. Then we can roll out. And this reversal, it's bad, but it's not the end of the world, I think.
Lei, how do you see this industrial plan going ahead globally?
Yeah, I think this is this industrial plan definitely. I think for the US is definitely a jump start, and it's really build up the US supply chain for this green economy. And but my point of view is this global long-term development still have to rely on the overall competitiveness. This cannot be a life-supporting system. So everybody have to think about when globally this incentive or this II go away, what will happen? And particularly, what intrigues me is this time, if you look at the past, there's incentive like tax credit for wind and solar in the past, which has almost happened domestically. So because you cannot export electricity, most likely. But this time, the competition is hydrogen, battery, EVs. This is global trading goods. It's going to move across broad. So once US have such a very generous incentive, it's going to make enterprise maybe sometimes too attractive, forget about to improve, to have this urgency, improve the cost competitiveness. Once the subsidy go away, this kind of global competition, whether still the US-made battery or US-made hydrogen is able to compete in Europe, there could be sometime worth to think about. So this is going to be a real global competition for the long run, not only a domestic supply chain, but a global goods, global trading commodities.
Mark, I'm going to ask you to jump in a second, but we actually have a QR code, so we're going to put it sort of just behind me. If you use it, you can send questions, and there's going to be a policy question. Actually, we have a poll as well. Which industry will be most transformed by industrial policy? So whilst you think about that, Mark, comments on what Lei was just saying?
Well, I'll pick up on another aspect of the IRA, which is in the air, which is around domestic manufacturing. So part of the incentives, part of the reason why it's so powerful is you can stack various incentives. And so the best, the highest incentive, I shouldn't say necessarily the best, but the highest incentive is you're producing, the green energy, but you're also manufacturing the components. And, you think about the example of offshore wind in the UK, one of the lessons, I don't know if it's a lesson in the end, but some take is they drove that industry to be cost competitive on an unsupported basis, but they didn't get the benefit or the full benefit of the domestic manufacturing. And then as Lei says, a number of, as we move from electrons into molecules, hydrogen, CCUS, hydrogen particularly, and EVs, you're moving to exportable goods as well. And so that incentive to kickstart domestic manufacturing is very strong. Now, governments need to be disciplined about this. I mean, it won't maybe surprise you to hear me say that, and decide where they truly can be competitive in that. And I'll make one other point on, if I may, which is to draw out partly the power of kickstarting investment. We're in the process of we intend to take over a large utility in Australia called Origin, with a big transition there, shutting down coal, getting rid of gas, building up 14 gigawatts of basically wind and storage. A order of magnitude that will take 6 percentage points of Australian emissions out. So big impact on the climate, good financial return, but importantly, it's big enough that we're looking at building domestic manufacturing as well. And so we have a MOU with Envision looking on the storage side. And it gets to the point when the policymakers are thinking about things, and when the key investors like Macquarie are thinking about things, if you're going in scale, if you incentivize something in scale, then it opens up other opportunities domestically in order for that security of supply to drive it.
So let's see if we actually have some results in for the poll. But Shemara, I'm going to ask you the question basically. I think you've already answered part of it, which is batteries. You see where it's made the most difference, probably in hydrogen and EVs. People are still voting. But where do you see some of the industrial policy actually making the real difference, Shemara?
I think it's basically in the areas where they haven't become the default choice of rational actors yet. Yeah. So I think passenger vehicles, they're already economically competitive because they're cheaper to run and they're not expensive capital cost-wise, but heavy vehicles need funding, and we're doing a project with the Green Climate Fund in India to provide a leasing facility so that heavy vehicle capital costs can be covered, and then as they earn better return later, they can pay us back. But basically, we've sort of, as I say, cracked the code on that. I do think areas like hydrogen, because the big thing in energy we need is firming solutions and batteries, and we're also working with Envision on many projects here where you're delivering technology, but we need firming solutions. So I agree with the audience that things like green hydrogen are very important. They're key to renewable energy to deliver firming. I think semiconductors, yes, I agree, but I also think we've been talking about carbon capture, direct air capture. If we're going to meet our net zero aspirations, we're going to have to take carbon out of the atmosphere as well. Long-haul transport as well, as I mentioned, things like sustainable aviation fuels. There's a lot of areas we need to invest in. And I respect what the US are doing, trying to create downstream industry domestically. Having said that, I look at it on a global perspective, and if you can get the cost of these things down, especially for the developing world, and we were talking with Ravi Menon at MAS yesterday about a challenge in Southeast Asia being that they have availability of newer, so hence very low-cost coal. And so just like Australia, you were talking about a big portion of their energy comes from coal. And there's a huge disincentive for governments politically to put carbon taxes on and make it more expensive for people to get affordable baseload energy. If we can get the costs down of alternatives to be more competitive, I think that's a big part of the solution.
Can I just jump in on this? So you have this, I mean, it's a massive issue, coal in Asia, managed phase out, as you say, and you've been working on helping to find solutions on that. In the context, as you know, of industrial policy, and actually this is quite, I mean, it's obviously a very well-informed audience because it's an open question. I mean, all of those industries are going to be affected and are being affected by industrial policy, and actually they all are they're related in all senses because the reality of the build-out on the major chip plants and the data centers and other things for AI, this absolute explosion, well, any company that's doing that, their first question after location is, well, where am I going to get my clean energy?
Yeah.
And so it's driving those other industries. So this industrial policy done right, and there's lots of ways to do it wrong, becomes self-reinforcing, right?
Yeah, and just one brief thing I was going to say, sorry, Lei, is that for a lot of those private sector off-takers, they can afford now to switch to clean energy, even if it's more expensive. A lot of the tech companies, for their data centres, etc., we need to make it affordable for the people who can't really get there. And I was briefly going to mention when we talk about industrial policy, the IRA subsidies are great, but you need a lot more to roll it out. It's being held up by permitting delays that are happening now, by lack of grid infrastructure, by further guidelines being needed, even things like bank regulatory rules that change the capital requirements, the tax equity. The banks are complaining in the US it'll restrain things. So.
Yeah, I do believe this survey has real insights. To change the world, we need two things. One is green electrons. Another is a green molecule. Today, the battle for green electron, we have won. But for green molecule, it's so important to decarbonize the hard-to-abate segment. For chemicals, for aviation fuel, for shipping fuel, this is the most urgently needed. So such II incentive or contract for difference is really going to build the scale of green hydrogen or hydrogen-related derivatives. Green ammonia, green methanol, green SAF, all actually originate from hydrogen. So this molecule world is most needed to solve the climate challenges.
But, Lei, there's also so much discussion about some of the different breakthroughs needed that will come from EV batteries. So where do you see it going next? I know that some of the things that are discussed, it's like sodium-ion, solid state. Like, what are you most excited about in batteries?
Yeah, I think so. Actually, the most exciting part actually is not be realized by so many people, but from my personal point of view, is very critical. Today, if you look at the green technology companies, they are very much, focused. Someone focused on building solar panels, someone focused on building batteries, some focused on building wind turbines. But think about the world transition. We are transitioning from a fossil fuel energy system to a renewable energy system. Who play this system approach? We need a company to able to build renewable energy system, really harmonize wind, solar, storage, digital, hydrogen in an orchestrated way. So it's going to become very challenging. That's why I always mention this is a cost of synergy. Synergy cost, we see, is going to become really important. That's why in Envision, we invent the green industrial park, net zero industrial park. We first time to build the green energy system together, even with industrial system, to really to make the product not only cost competitive, but also emission free. But this is a small example of great solution. But overall, the world is need such kind of renewable energy system. This is most needed from my point of view.
And can I just briefly say it's exciting and inspirational what Envision's doing, because it's showing people you can actually build good business responding to what is a challenge, but also a huge opportunity, I think, all the sectors you're...
Mark, how are the banks doing? So they're, the global, I guess, gatekeepers for capital. How are they doing in terms of investment in the space?
Well, it's an interesting question. I guess I don't think in this space one thinks first of the banks. One thinks of the Macquaries, the Brookfields, the other big infrastructure investors, and the core, the core underlying businesses like Envision. And yes, there is a role for some leverage on it, but what unlocks it, what the gatekeeper, to use your term, is the gatekeepers have opened the gate. Maybe is the best way to say it, and looking for a series of opportunities, and there are more opportunities than there is capital dedicated to the space at the moment. All of that said, I think it bears reminding that if we look back 5-6 years, the total investment in what we're talking about globally was $500 billion. As you notice on the stairs, as you walk up in this hall, I think they have the 1.2 trillion figure, which is what it was last year, and is tracking for 1.8 trillion, or almost twice as the investment in conventional. So a lot of money is getting into it from various sources. The bank leverage is, no disrespect to the banks, it's supplemental, but it's not decisive.
What are some of the non-financial barriers, Shemara, to getting this done?
Look, I was mentioning things like, the permitting time it's taking for environmental approvals for impact studies. The US, through the NEPA, that Act on the New Environmental Protection Act, is trying to put time limits. So we fully respect that this has to be assessed, environmental and community impacts, but it's going slowly. And so they're putting time limits on. Others, Europeans, are putting resourcing into it. That's one of the issues. Clarity of the policies and implementability is one of the issues, and then supporting investment. The US also is, investing in trying to make the labour supply available for this, creating new industries. But I have to say, to me, I think the challenge much more is on the investable opportunity side, because Mark, through GFANs and other examples, have mobilised massive amounts of capital, but they ultimately say to me, especially in developing markets, we need projects that de-risk and allow us to come and catalyse the sector. And that's where I think people like us are working, is bringing our skills.
If I may, and I'm going to end up Lei, do you mind if I ask a question of Lei in this? I'll reinforce, the permitting absolutely in advanced economies, those issues. The big issue that we and others have been working on, Noel Quinn who's here, others, have been around capital for the transition in the emerging and developing world, and that needs to scale from where it is today, a couple $100 million to $1 trillion of cross-border capital by the end of the decade. So those are big, big numbers, and there's a series of issues around that. But if I can just kind of open up an issue for Lei, which is, as we move to the molecules, that we've got hydrogen over your shoulder there, and you have hydrogen on the mind all the time. The issue, in some respects, is getting clear offtakes and demand, and and industrial policy can play a supportive role in that. But I think maybe just invite a perspective on that, because we're getting close to the tipping point in terms of the economics. And is the demand going to be there?
Yeah, good point. So Envision have this commitment to bring the green molecule affordable, even before the II announced. So from my point of view, we have two ways. One is industrial policy. Another hand is the innovation, technology breakthrough.
Yes.
So we should never forget the most fundamental hand, this technology breakthrough. Mm-hmm. If you look back, the why wind and solar is so cost competitive. Of course, at the beginning days, have the renewable law from Germany, have the contract for difference from UK. But overall is the technology breakthrough which make the cost of wind and solar back to 20 years ago, it's dropped almost 90 to 95%. Now that's why this numerous technology breakthrough make this wind and solar become winner. So now when we think about these green molecules, again, so we should really have this deep investment of technology breakthrough on the electrolyzer, synthetic ammonium synthesis, or ammonia cracking, so back into hydrogen.
Yes.
This kind of technology breakthrough is really able to make the hydrogen cost competitive. But most importantly, again, is about the renewable energy system. Today, 80% of green hydrogen cost is coming from electricity, 80%. So today's company only do wind, solar alone, but you need a renewable energy system which even bypass the grid, become a net zero industrial park, directly supply electrolyzing the water, which make electricity so cost competitive. So that's another innovative way I'm mentioning why the renewable energy system is so important.
And can I just briefly say, I think exactly I agree with you on technology being the key, not just for hydrogen, but making it transportable, so ammonia, green iron, etc. I think it's hard for corporate off-takers to play a role there. I was looking at the stats, there's 378 of us now signed up to RE100. We need 275 terawatt hours of energy. Yeah. But it's much easier for us to go to, Norsk Hydro are doing a project with us in Brazil. They're the off-taker for wind and solar. The subsidy is not huge. But for us to be an off-taker for hydrogen when the economics are so unviable at the moment is hard. So that's why I think governments have to support the technology investment to get the cost down and make it transportable. Then corporates can come in and off-take. But I think it's hard.
It's hard, but hard things are hard, and sometimes hard things are necessary. And I don't think we can sequence this fully in terms of getting the cost down. I mean, you've pursued a supply-driven, if you will. If you build it and build it at low cost, which you've done, they will come. Yeah. But encouraging them coming and hand in glove with policy. And I know we're running short on time. If I can just make one other point.
And then we talk COP. See, most journalists are worried about AI. I'm just worried about Mark Carney taking my job.
No, I was trying to worry that you didn't get all your things in. I was going to make a point on COP, which is, the thing that most want to get out of COP, or can be most impactful, is actually just to keep with what Lei's been saying and Shemara on systems, is to bring together a series of initiatives that exist around exactly these set of issues, which is who is going to accelerate, pull through a combination of industrial policy, our topic, but corporate action, corporate leaders, and there's a series of initiatives around that, but they're not yet getting the traction they need at scale. And then, GFANs, the members, whether it's Macquarie, Brookfield, HSBC, whoever, provides the financing against that really accelerates. And that's what we need to do, and that's part of the opportunity, I'll stop here, of getting everyone around the table at COP. And I think that's, so we should look for something and push for something on that front.
But you're hopeful about COP? That we get something concrete?
I think all the right people are there, and the right issues have been put on the table. So, yes, I mean, in that regard, we should, you never take things for granted, but we should force the issue, force the decisions.
Shemara, for COP20?
Look, I think this is a long journey, and we've got to be patient because it'll be slow early and then accelerate. So every COP, we've got to move on the areas of issue. I would say the money we're investing is not charitable money. We've got savers of the world, retirees, we've got to get return for risk from. So we've got to keep going on this journey of creating investable solutions.
Lei, are you optimistic about COP?
Yeah.
What do you need from COP?
I'm particularly optimistic about some initiative I think Mark is proposing. So I'm looking forward to it. We definitely need acceleration, especially to have this kind of comprehensive platform approach to really integrate all the industrial policy, technology, private segment, investment, all kind of things together to really create a kind of aggregation power.
And so, Mark, is it also money to emerging markets? Really, I mean, if there are two things that we really need to get done at COP.
We need a new framework to get money to emerging market is absolute, that's first, I would say, from global fairness and others. And maybe just the last point, if we can start to, the spirit of this conversation underscores just how interconnected the global economy needs to be around moving to a sustainable economy. I mean, this innovation coming out of China, many examples of that, we need those linkages if we're going to move at the speed the world needs to move.
Thank you so much for a very spirited conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.